All right. So, hello everybody. My name is Abby Cook, and today we're going to be investigating how Supreme Court justices make their decisions exactly. So, before I dive into that, I'd just like to invite you all to think about how many times you've heard the following terms used in mainstream media to directly refer to the United States Supreme Court: conservative bloc, liberal bloc, conservative justice, liberal justice. All of these terms indicate or paint a picture of a United States Supreme Court that is bitterly divided along the lines of political ideology and individual attitudes. So what exactly does this mean? It means that the perception of the court in the United States is changing to a largely political one. And this perception is compounded or reinforced by televised, highly controversial Senate confirmation hearings for nominees to the highest court. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these women. So we have Amy Coney Barrett, and you can see the votes to confirm on the screen here. She's typically categorized as a conservative justice, and then more recently, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed, and she's labeled as a liberal justice that's replacing liberal Justice Breyer. So in this instance, you can definitely see that it's bitterly divided along party lines and potentially ideological ones as well. So essentially, again, we ask kind of, what does this mean for us if this is how we're looking at the United States Supreme Court? Excuse me. So essentially, the mainstream media is shattering this myth of legality. So when I say myth of legality, I'm talking about how the United States Supreme Court as an institution is just heralded as this very objective legal body. It's impenetrable to outside influences, specifically the ideological attitudes of individual justices, or perhaps even public opinion. But now that we're aware of this political dimension of the court, where can we go from here? And how is the Supreme Court a political institution? The Supreme Court is political in several ways. One in that it deals with very much so emotionally charged fundamental issues. I'm sure if I were to list a bunch of salient issues right now, whether you identify as openly political or not, something is burning inside of you. You have an opinion about that specific issue. And the gravity of resolving such issues influences the decision of the justices. They can't entirely divorce themselves from public opinion, but they also do have a legal duty to carry out as these revered members of the legal community. And the resolution of these legal questions, and legal is typically intertwined, as we've seen in many cases with the political, it's addressing political governance, political values, political rights, political power, all things that are relevant to us and our rights. So again, we ask ourselves, well, now that we're aware of this dimension, what can we do? What vocabulary can we use? Should we despair knowing that the highest court in the land is not as impenetrable as we've been told? So where we can go from here is talking about many different models, and then hopefully from this talk we can kind of glean what direction we can go in and how exactly these justices make their decisions. So before we go into those models, I think it's important that we share the same concept of what exactly judicial decision-making is. So simply put, judicial decision-making is the process by which judges reach decisions, and these are typically influenced by three factors, being ideological polarization, precedent, and the separation of power structure. And again, I'm talking about US domestic politics. So the attitudinal model, I was alluding to that before. It's typically the one advanced in mainstream media that the conservative justices or the liberal justices are going to rule in a certain way. There might potentially be a swing justice. All of those terms are relevant here. So it corresponds to ideological polarization, which is referring to the extent to which the public and elected officials have varying beliefs on salient political issues. So that's typically when we hear about that, that spectrum between conservative and liberal, right, or vice versa, or where someone might land on that. So the attitudinal model might be one of the most simplistic of the models that are available in the literature. So first, a justice just identifies with a political ideology. So I'm going to refer to that throughout this presentation as an attitude or an opinion. And everyone's political ideology forms throughout their childhood, throughout their education, perhaps the career that they decide to enter into. So think about the justice also being human in that regard and having this specific political ideology that they've developed throughout their life. So this justice is directly using, in this model, this ideology as a lens for evaluating relevant persons, places, institutions, and things, as well as the situation in which those things kind of arise within a specific case. So it's just this typical ABC diagram where the justice is rendering a decision squarely aligned with their political attitudes. All a justice would have to do is kind of hint about their perspective, and then that would automatically correspond with what they ended up deciding. The next model is a little bit more complex with a few other factors, but this is the legal model, so this kind of corresponds with precedent, right? That idea that there's this myth of legality. So precedent, simply put, is just previous court decisions and principles and rules established within those. And it's basically, what's the law on the books? What's written down? What have we decided in the past? How much do those weigh? How much precedential value do they have? So, in this instance, the justice, again, is tasked with issuing a decision, and it considers three essential factors, and these factors are law, history, and precedent. They're considered in no particular order, and they might be given a certain weight, depending, again, on who the justice is, but again, it's making decisions squarely in line with these three factors. So you'd be able to kind of predict based on, again, what's on the books. But again, this kind of in another way is also oversimplifying the fact that it could be influenced by a justice's individual attitudes and then even more factors as we continue on with this presentation. All right, the third model is the strategic model, and it corresponds to the separation of powers model. So we have that in the United States. So all that means is that the judicial power, the executive power, and the legislative power are all separated into different branches to kind of prevent the formation of a centralized government. So the strategic model is, again, directly in line with that. So we're going to be talking about four actors, and by actors, I mean really like a person, an institution, any kind of collectivity that's exerting an influence here. So these four factors are the opinions or attitudes of the justices' fellow justices, those of the executive branch and the legislative branch, as well as public opinion. So specifically on a case, especially since they're serving lifetime appointments, they might get a certain sense that their colleague might decide a case in a certain way. So that might affect if they're deciding to join the majority opinion, if they're writing a concurring opinion, if they'd like to dissent, if they'd like to concur, and then dissent in part, which is really fun. But bottom line is that they're behaving as a strategic actor. They're not just kind of squarely making a decision along a certain spectrum. And then the opinions specifically of the executive branch and legislative branch come in because the Supreme Court is very much so dependent on what these branches think of its holdings, because if the Supreme Court didn't have enforceability of its holdings, then it really wouldn't have much of a role within the American judicial system, right? And the highest court of the land needs to be able to make those decisions and needs to be able to garner respect of both of those branches. So that's how those branches could retaliate, or they could invigorate the public if they harbor specific negative attitudes about the outcome of a case. So all of these actors, all of their opinions, attitudes, they're taken into consideration in no particular order, and some of them might be accorded different weight, but ultimately we get to point F here. So now that we reviewed three different models of judicial decision making, and I know that was a lot of information, so thank you for bearing with me, we're going to investigate what this could look like visualized if we put them all together. So first, we're going to start with the justice has their own ideological preferences, right? We know what those are. It could be it's completely individualized based on that justice. Those preferences are then constrained by the legal model and the strategic model. And just for your memory, the legal model is made up of law, history, and precedent, whereas the strategic model specifically is looking at the attitudes of fellow justices, the executive and legislative branches, and the opinion of the public. And then to make this even more complex, sometimes there exists a tension between the legal model and the strategic models themselves. But ultimately, this conveys that judicial decision-making is actually maybe far more complex than the media purports it to be, because we're still making a decision. A justice may choose to reach that decision considering all of these different attitudes and factors. They're all legitimate avenues that they may decide to go down. So what are our main takeaways? We've learned that the Supreme Court is a political institution in several ways, and that judicial decision-making is actually very complex, and that justices have to consider a variety of factors in order to preserve the legitimacy of the court. But what's important here is to recognize that justices do not make decisions purely in an ideological vacuum. It's, again, far more complex, and still a lot of research is needed in this field. It's actually a very neglected field of research within political science and other social sciences. And we shouldn't despair that the Supreme Court no longer is just a purely legal institution to us because of how the mainstream media has exposed its political dimension. Instead, we should endeavor to understand what exactly this dimension is so we can be more informed actors and participants in the legal community ourselves, because we do have that power. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk today, and if you have any questions about the models or anything that I'm particularly passionate about, you can feel free to email me. But thank you so much for listening to my talk.